Okay. Good morning from Los Angeles. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to have so many people with us today. I'm Michael Rothberg, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the UCLA Working Group in Memory Studies to this event marking the publication of Andreas Huyssen's book, Memory Art in the Contemporary World, Confronting Violence in the Global South. We're fortunate to have Andreas Huyssen with us today, along with Saloni Mathur of UCLA and Kaitlin Murphy of the University of Arizona, who will each respond to Andreas's book. Before introducing today's event, I want to thank my co-organizers in the working group, Yair Agman, Rebecca Chai, Rachel Kaufman, and Sharon Zelnick, all of whom are here as well. This is going to be our last Zoom book event of the academic year, but look out for a program on poetry, memory, and archives organized by Rachel Kaufman. That event is going to take place on May 30th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and it's going to feature 3 contemporary poets in dialogue with Rachel about issues of cultural memory and archives. So today we'll begin with a presentation by Andreas Huyssen, who will introduce his book. Saloni, Mathur, and Kaitlin Murphy will give responses of 5 to 10 minutes. After Andreas has had a chance to respond, in turn, we'll open things up for discussion, and you can use the chat feature to pose questions or raise your hand, and we'll call on you at that point. So let me now introduce Andreas Huyssen, who is the Villard Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He was the founding director of Columbia's Center for Comparative Literature and Society as well. I've been an admirer of Andreas Huyssen's work for a very long time. In around 2004, when I took over as director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory at the University of Illinois, the first person I invited to speak was, in fact, Andreas Huyssen. I don't know if Andreas remembers that event.
I remember it well, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Andreas was an obvious choice for me, not only because I had for many years felt a great affinity with his work, but also because I knew that he was a scholar who would speak compellingly across fields and disciplines and areas about issues that were ethically and politically vital. Although it's been almost 20 years since that first invitation, I feel exactly the same way today. His many books and essays remain essential guides to 20th and 21st century culture and cultural politics. What I find particularly remarkable is Andreas's ability to stay in sync, but critically so, with the morphing cultural and political scene. After early books on German Romanticism, Schlegel, and the drama of Sturm und Drang, Andreas turned definitively, I think, to modern and contemporary culture. As one of the founding editors of the journal New German Critique, he played an essential role in bringing Frankfurt School critical theory and other tendencies in German intellectual life to the English-speaking world. It's impossible to overstate the importance of that journal for generations of scholars, including mine. Among Andreas's many books that have made an indelible mark on critical discourse of the recent decades, I would first mention After the Great Divide, Modernism, Mass Culture, Postmodernism, which offers, especially in the essay Mapping the Postmodern, one of the most nuanced accounts of the relation between modernity and postmodernity and between high and low culture that I know. After the Great Divide also includes a chapter called The Politics of Identification on the German reception of the American TV series Holocaust, which is an essay that I continue to refer to on a regular basis. That important chapter on Holocaust anticipates the turn that Andreas's work would take in the coming decades to questions of memory and to the cultural and political legacies of the Nazi period and Shoah. In his 2 equally crucial books, Twilight Memories, Marking Time in a Culture of Amnesia, and Present Pasts, Urban Palimpsests and the Politics of Memory, Andreas helped set the agenda for the emerging interdisciplinary field of memory studies. These books, and all of Andreas's work, are remarkable for their range of reference, for the genres and media they address, and increasingly for their global scope. There's a persistent interest in visual culture as well as literature, with essays on painters like Anselm Kiefer and on monuments, memorials, and museums in Twilight Memories, And then in present pasts, a turn to what today we call the Global South, with essays on art and memory in Argentina and Colombia. And that move beyond Europe leads us to today's topic, Andreas's most recent book, Memory Art in the Contemporary World. The new book is a beautiful reflection on and fine-grained analysis of the possibilities of art and cultural memory in a world of political violence and structural inequality, with stops in India, South Africa, and Latin America. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today, and I'm now going to turn things over to Andreas Huyssen for his introductory remarks. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you, Michael, very much for an all too flattering introduction. And thanks also to the seminar, to the working group, for having me to present this book. It's great. I mean, I've had another book launch, 2 book launches actually in New York, and the launching keeps going. Anyway, I am, as many of you know, part of that first post-fascist generation in Germany. So memory and forgetting have been central to my life and published work for decades. The rise of the field of memory studies since the 1980s led me to observe and write about traveling Holocaust tropes and images in Latin America after the end of the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, in civil war-torn Colombia, in post-apartheid South Africa, and in contemporary India. Doris Salcedo, who had read some of my earlier work on Holocaust memory in Germany, approached me for a catalog essay for one of her shows. So did Nalini Milani and Vivant Sundaram, both of whom I first met at a conference of artists, critics, and curators convened by Gita Kapoor in Mumbai in the late 1990s. Guillermo Kwiatka and Marcelo Brodsky I met in those same years in Buenos Aires, where I was giving lectures about German memory culture at the Art Foundation, POA. I was deeply touched by William Kentridge's drawing for projection, Felix in Exile, which I watched multiple times, almost obsessively, at Documenta 10 in Kassel in 1997. I began to understand Kentridge's work better after I had met and interviewed him in Johannesburg during Okwe Enversor's second Joburg Biennial later that year. But slowly, my interest in how Holocaust memory functioned in other traumatic histories of violence gave way to exploring formal affinities among these artists from the Global South. The work of these artists first encountered each other and their viewers in Third World biennials at the time of a growing international human rights movement and emerging cross-continental networks of truth and reconciliation commissions, memory museums, and commemorative projects around the world. By now, of course, their work has become quite successful, but they had just emerged then into public consciousness when I first encountered their work and began to write about it. Clearly, the work challenged me to go beyond, to think beyond German history, and it was specifically their use of Holocaust tropes and images that helped me overcome hesitations to write about art from parts of the world so far from my own expertise. Now, each chapter of my book discusses a few specific works by 2 artists from vastly different geographic areas and historical contexts. These constellations are organized according to common themes and forms, spaces of violence, shadow plays, or traveling trauma tropes, or they focus on the spaces of installation, gallery, museum, urban space. Bringing these works into proximity with each other reveals aesthetic and political affinities as these artists negotiate their respective traumatic experiences by making imaginative use of received artistic legacies and practices, both local and transnational. The south-to-south axis of my juxtapositions is then crossed by a south-to-north axis, manifest in the ways these artists have all drawn on the archive of northern modernisms and postmodernisms, appropriating or counter-appropriating artistic strategies, techniques, and forms, and re-articulating them from their post-colonial perspectives. The third dimension, of course, is the north to south axis, present in my approach coming out of an expanded reading of critical theory, especially the aesthetic theory of Adorno. Now, the book thus joins two dimensions of memory shared by my artists: memory of national eruptions of recent state violence, articulated from within. And the artists I write about all work from their home countries, rather than from some Western metropolis. And the memory of a broad and diverse archive of the Western art forms from the 20th century. Expressionism and Soviet revolutionary art in Kentridge, avant-garde theater in Kwiatka, minimalist sculpture in Salcedo and Sundaram, public urban installations in Salcedo and Kentridge, radical post-Brechtian theater in Malani. Now, much of this art relies heavily on installation and ephemeral performance, while working out of older, sometimes obsolete mediums of art. By creating constellations of specific works across borders and boundaries, I have suggested points of affinity and contact among these artists from India, Latin America, and South Africa. Here are some examples, and Michael will now help me put the images up. First one. Okay. The motif and Salcedo. Kwiatka paints on discardable cardboard an early series of works entitled Nadie olvida nada, Nobody Forgets Anything. Salcedo transforms a bed frame into sculpture, with parts of the frame wrapped by bandages, pointing to an invisible wound. Absence of the disappeared is central to both. Next. Then there's the affective transformation of minimalist sculpture in Salcedo and Sundaram. Salcedo creates furniture sculptures, armoires or chairs filled uncannily with cement, in which residues of human clothing or bone fragments are barely visible. Next. Or mutilated tables in the series called Unland, the Columbia of the Civil War as a dystopia. Next. Sundaram's installation Memorial uses minimalist materials very differently, with its multiple the Soviet and American unknown fallen, a direct reference to a newspaper photo, next, of a Muslim victim of the Hindu mob riots of 1992. Next, the use of the shadow play as major medium of memory is found in Malani and Kentridge, both of whom use stop-motion animation in their spectacular filmic installations. And I wish here I could show image in motion, but actually it wasn't possible. In her work, Malani mobilizes Indian and European, but stay with the earlier one, the mythological narrative, mainly centered around women figures like Cassandra and Medea, Draupadi and Sita, putting them into motion in her installations. Kentridge did several stop-motion animation films based on his graphic novel-like drawings, which featured key existential and political issues of the apartheid and post-apartheid years, such as economic exploitation, mass protest, accountability, and truth and reconciliation. Learning from the shadows becomes a metaphor in Kentridge for learning from memory in these artists' very different uses of the shadow play. Next, both Salcedo and Sundaram repurposed the well-known Holocaust image of piles of worn shoes, transforming it in ways that inscribe local traumatic experiences into the work. Next, the move outwards from studio and gallery to installations in urban space is present in Kentridge's Rome fresco called Triumphs and Laments. It evokes the melancholy history of empire from the foundation of Rome to migrants drowning in the Mediterranean off Italy's shores today. And also then, next, in Salcedo's allegorical reconstruction of the 1985 guerrilla occupation of Bogota's Palace of Justice and the ensuing massacre committed by the army trying to liberate the building. This is the left image on the screen. Or in her Istanbul installation on the right, in which empty chairs again signify death or lives turned upside down, referring to mass expulsions of Greeks from Turkey in the earlier 20th century. Salcedo's memory installation at the Palace of Justice, which is both documentary and abstract, arguably had a significant impact on the later trial of those responsible for the massacre. Finally, next, both Salcedo and Sundaram created works of institutional critique as they temporarily transformed major museums in London and Calcutta, drawing attention to their colonial heritage and its afterlife in the present. Next. Salcedo created a crack all along the foundational floor in Tate Modern's huge turbine hall. She called it shibboleth, thus referring the spectator in an overdetermined way to the biblical story of a deadly crossing of a body of water, to contemporary migrants' death in the Mediterranean, and to the exclusionary habitus of the Western art world. Refunctioned the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta, a colonial building dedicated to the memory of space, highlighting an alternative history of Bengal modernity under British imperialism. Now, all of these works, about which there would be so much more to say, of course, as I do in the book, are loosely connected by the development of installation as form, in combination with different artistic media, such as painting, sculpture, and drawing, or different technical supports, such as video, animation, and film. Ultimately, however, such affinities evoke a semblance of solidarity between geographically separated bodies of traumatic histories. The work becomes an important aspect of memory culture at large, one that aims at new forms of cohabitation across cultural and geographic divides. Now, to conclude, I have no illusions about the power of art being able to move things substantively in the world. The demand never again, or nunca más, already shipwrecked in the 1990s in Bosnia and Rwanda. But I do have some trust in the power of art to create spaces of reflection and empathy, to question and challenge reified forms of official and sanctioned memory, to create shared meaning in deeply divided societies, to strengthen demands for accountability, to sabotage organized forgetting, and last but not least, to resist the neo-fascist memory revisionism that has recently arisen in many parts of the world. Such purposes can be pursued either by political art activism, the kind of direct, crisp, and cutting intervention in the public sphere that often resembles slapstick and draws on avant-garde techniques of estrangement or détournement. Or it can be achieved by the temporally very different mode of what Doris Salcedo has called acts of memory, installations that require slow reception, active immersion and contemplation, both intellectual and sensual, in works and installations exhibited in gallery, museum, or public urban space. Two forms of artistic intervention then. One quick, fugitive, and geared to immediate political effect. The other slow, engendering long-term effects, lingering engagement, and enlightenment, nourished by affect and emotion created through complex aesthetic means. Now, if I foreground the idea of aesthetic autonomy for such acts of memory, I simply mean to reassert the affective and cognitive power of artworks at a time when a relational aesthetic of immediate gratification, the aesthetic of commodified lifestyle and neoliberal enterprise culture has taken over. In a world in which practically everything can claim to be aesthetic, it seems to me we need to guard or salvage the ways in which art can be understood in Adorno's pithy formulation as both aesthetically autonomous and as social fact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was really, I think, useful in thinking about the book and also thinking about the larger questions about aesthetics and politics that you raise in the book, and both the contextualization that you gave and also the chance to see some of the art in color like that was really great. So thank you for that. I'm going to now introduce our two respondents, ask them to respond in turn to the book, and then we'll take it from there. So it's a pleasure now to introduce first Saloni Mathur. Saloni is professor of art history and chair of the Department of Art History at UCLA. She specializes in modern and contemporary South Asian art. Her most recent book is A Fragile Inheritance: Radical Stakes in Contemporary Indian Art, published by Duke University Press. Her other books include India by Design, Colonial History and Cultural Display, and the edited collections, The Migrant's Time, Rethinking Art History and Diaspora, and Making Strange, a volume dedicated to the artist Vivan Sundaram, one of the figures whom Andreas Huyssen just introduced to us. After Saloni, we'll hear from Kaitlin Murphy. Kaitlin is Associate Professor of Social, Cultural, and Critical Theory and Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Arizona. She's the author of Mapping Memory, Visuality, Affect, and Embodied Politics in the Americas, published by Fordham University Press. And she's one of the co-editors of the Routledge Handbook of Memory Activism, which we featured in our last book event. Kaitlin has published articles in Memory Studies, Genocide Studies and Prevention, Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, and Human Rights Review, and is currently working on a book called Future Histories, Memory, Violence, and Decolonial Reimaginings. So I'll turn it over first to Saloni. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Michael? Look, thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for this invitation to respond to Andreas's work. I'm honored by it. And thank you, Andreas, of course, for this extremely stimulating book. As always, I feel informed, enlightened, and inspired by the enormous intelligence and clarity of Andreas's ideas and his writing, and that has been true for decades now for me. Memory art in the contemporary world, of course, as Andreas just summarized, investigates the critical potential of artists who are confronting forms of political violence that emerge from their own societies in India, Latin America, and South Africa. It is about a certain poetics and politics of memory that has been galvanized specifically by visual practices. What he describes, it's about what he describes as the puzzling interpenetration of past, presents, and futures that emerges in their works in parallel and yet very different ways in very different parts of the world. Andreas is thus particularly attentive in this book to forms and processes. For example, gestures of repetition, as what he calls compulsive repetition in certain works. He's equally attentive to materials and techniques. It matters, of course, in Andreas's book where the found object is found, because that's the relationship of artists to their materials. Also techniques like the spectral effects of the shadow play. And he's, of course, attentive to recurring motifs and visual vocabularies like the empty bed or the chair that you have just seen in the works of Salcedo and Sundaram. All of these operations speak to the mechanisms of memory and forgetting in the face of traumatic societal past. The book is something to me of a curatorial act, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, whereby new sort of groupings or what he calls constellations of artists and artworks, and unexpected juxtapositions give rise to new sightlines, to different narratives and alternative ways of seeing. So when I say a curatorial act, I mean that in the best sense, the way it galvanizes, in other words, alternative ways of seeing. As an art historian who has written about contemporary art in South Asia for over 2 decades now, I am struck by the way that Andreas's experience has paralleled my own. And by that, I mean to say that his investments and interests in the vanguard practices of contemporary art in the global South goes back to the 1990s, as he just explained, as do my own, when I was just a humble graduate student in New York, learning, of course, from Andreas's books. So I am thus acutely aware that Andreas has been writing about several of the artists in this study, Doris Salcedo, William Kentridge, Nalini Malani, and Vivan Sundaram, for example, for almost 25 years, which has taken the form of numerous earlier essays, catalog engagements, interviews, meetings, and so on, all of which might be seen to culminate in this book. So one observation I have is about Andreas's own practice as a theorist and, I would say, a visual thinker, who has for decades now been drawn to what he also describes as both the affective and cognitive power of the visual arts. The art critic Craig Owens, who was writing in New York in the 1990s at the height of the AIDS crisis, once described the act of engagement with a critical art practice as an effort to, quote, write alongside contemporary art rather than to write about it. And this seems to me true for Andreas as well. I see him as writing alongside the artists in this study over time, a long time, over 2 decades. That is, as an interlocutor who has been constantly learning and moving with, and learning from a dialogue and moving alongside our artists engaged with the challenges of memory and history specific to their own societies in the global South. As Andreas himself stated, their work challenged me to think beyond German history. And in his afterword to the book, he notes that it took time for him to, quote, gain a measure of confidence and courage to write about these artists, unquote, because of the fact that their work was so distant from his primary area of expertise. So the book, I find very touching, is distinguished by, of course, Andreas's great command and mastery as a thinker, and this element of vulnerability about venturing beyond his comfort zone, his area of knowledge, as it were. Iteration for this venturing out has occurred over the past 25 years. But nevertheless, there's this kind of element of a student learning still in Andreas's book. So I could go on with many other observations and responses, but in the interest of time, I have formulated 3, what I see as kind of elemental, larger questions that emerge for me about the project that I would like to pose to Andreas in order to hopefully generate a discussion. So the first question is related to this notion of memory art that is at the heart of the project, the title of the project. So I wanted to ask Andreas if he could say more about memory art as a category for us, your readers, to think with. As you acknowledge, Andreas, memory art, of course, is really a vast field encompassing many, many different kinds of practices. Nonetheless, your book seeks to conceptualize and even theorize the notion of something called memory art. And you refer to the artists and protagonists in your study as, quote, memory artists. So what work would you like that category to do for us? Or is it a normative category at all, if that implies something fixed or categorical, raising questions of inclusion and exclusion and so on? And so to put that a little bit differently, does the question of what does and doesn't count as memory art, does that even interest you? Or should we be embracing this concept in different kinds of ways? So that's my first question about that concept of memory art. The second question relates to my earlier point that one of the most distinguishing aspects of this book within Andreas's larger and very influential oeuvre is something that I find both courageous and very compelling, that is to say, the framework of the Global South. So, Andreas, I'd love to hear you elaborate on the importance of this perspective and, of course, the comparative dimension of this project. And the third question is related to this sort of geopolitical reorientation. And I would love to hear Andreas reflect further on something that you noted in your introduction that really stayed with me. And Andreas states in the introduction that, and I'm quoting him, the renewed prominence of debates about slavery in the US and colonialism in Europe. With this renewed prominence, we have entered, according to Andreas, another stage of the memory debates, unquote. And this seems to me to potentially really expand the concept of memory art as something that no longer sort of is attached to or belongs to the Global South, as it does in this project, and that is instead equally applicable to contemporary art practices throughout Euro-American metropoles, that we could see as sharing a kind of similar historical consciousness. And many, many artists, therefore, come to mind as memory artists, in Andreas's term, that are based in the European and American metropoles. So just, for instance, Kara Walker, Isaac Julian, Hugh Locke, Kadratia, Yinka Shonibari, Shirin Nashad, and really the list for me goes on and on and on. So I would like to ask Andreas to perhaps speak to the implications of this, because such an expanded vision might require changing the subtitle of his book from Confronting Violence in the Global South to Confronting Violence in the Contemporary World. So in other words, a very kind of biggish expansion. So with those three questions, Andreas, I'll stop there, and I guess allow Kaitlin to proceed with her response.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Saloni.
you.
And we'll turn things over to Kaitlin now.
All right. Thank you to Michael Rothberg and the UCLA Working Group in Memory Studies for the invitation to join you. This is one of the pleasures of Zoom, although, of course, I'm always looking for a reason to visit LA. This gives us an opportunity to be together this morning. And also, I will be at MSA. If any of you will be there in Newcastle this summer, please come say hello in person. And also thank you to Andreas for the opportunity to engage with your scholarship and the works of these artists. Similar to Saloni, I have been reading your work for a long time, and it was a delight to read this book, to sort of have in conversation Andreas, who's an artist of words and ideas, with brilliant artists of images and ideas. It actually was just a real pleasure to read. So thank you for that. As Michael mentioned, I've written a few different things about memory, and I'm now working on a book about memory art and acts as intervention, thinking about how memory acts in the public sphere are often asked to or intended to produce certain effects, although of course whether or not they actually do once they are set free in the wild is a very different question. And so all this is to say that I've been thinking a lot about memory on a personal, familial, collective, and larger sociopolitical scale. And many of these artists, I think, are very important people to be thinking with as we consider the potential impact and also possible limitations of memory sort of on a sociopolitical battle between remembering and forgetting, which seems to be ongoing. This book is important and it's unusual, as Andreas points out, because of its geographic reach. Andreas has compiled an archive here of artworks and sites from across the global south. Of course, Cuitca from Argentina, Salcedo from Colombia, Kentrids from South Africa, Malani and Sundaram from India, Guzman from Chile, and then of course the memory museums in both Santiago and Bogota. As Global South scholar and Garland Mahler reminds us, quote, while the term Global South is often used to refer to economically disadvantaged nation states and as a post-Cold War alternative to the term Third World. In recent years, the Global South is being deployed in a post-national sense to address spaces and people negatively impacted by capitalist globalization. So as a concept, then, Global South captures a deterritorialized geography of capitalism's externalities and means to account for subjugated peoples within the borders of wealthier countries as well, such that there are souths in the global in the geographic north and norths in the geographic south. This gives the concept of a global south and a global north both a horizontality and a verticality to a comparative study of cultural production. This becomes especially salient in a study of artists making work about the very much ongoing lived afterlives of systemic violence implemented under imperialism, colonialism, and various forms of oppressive subjugation and occupation. In other words, my point is that while much can be gained from monographic studies of countries and artists, as Andreas correctly identifies, it should not be at the sacrifice of a recognition and exploration of the fundamentally intrinsic ties between the global north and south. The filmmaker, Chilean filmmaker Patricio Guzman, whose work closes out the end of the book, is a perfect example of this. He is Chilean. He studied filmmaking in both Chile and Spain. When he was forced into exile after Pinochet's occupation and subsequent dictatorship, he was detained and then fled into exile in Paris, where he lived for many years as a Chilean filmmaker, making Chilean films that for a long time were banned in Chile and only were able to be shown decades later. So attention to this south, north, east, west axis, although of course is much more of a constellation or a complex web than an axis, is especially important for the artists under study here because of the mobility and access that comes with international prestige, of which these artists in particular possess. And I just want to know, I'm happy to be going after Saloni here, but it's important to note my own limitations. I cannot claim any expertise when it comes to the Indian artists, Vivan Sundaram and Nalini Mulani. The other artists, I do know their work fairly well, but if I say something today and you think to yourself, well, yes, yeah, you're correct, except for when it comes to Sundaram and Mulani, you are probably right, I accept. But there is much that could be said about any and all of these artists, and certainly also about the role of international prestige versus local grassroots memory work and memory art. But given the short amount of time that we have, I wanted to offer a couple of reflections and openings that we might choose to walk through later as part of our discussion. So the first is the question of abstraction or opacity versus specificity. Much visual memory work hinges on the premise that seeing atrocity and gross human rights violations will influence public opinion, in turn prompting increased pressure on decision makers and demands for cessation or intervention into human rights abuses. History has demonstrated that this belief in the power of the image is both partially warranted and overly optimistic. Nonetheless, this desire for a direct equation between visual text, usually photography and documentary film, and the acquisition of knowledge and social and political change persists. Scholars have studied aspects of this visual economy at length, arguing that images and visual culture more broadly can create the condition for viewers to more effectively bear witness to human rights abuses with all that this entails, giving us phrases including bearing witness, ethical spectatorship, seeing for, empathic vision, ethical imagination, and ethical vision. The ability of images to touch viewers, shape public opinion, and influence political change has been demonstrated in tangible ways across the globe. The question then is not whether or not images can have an impact, but how and under what conditions and the ultimate extent of that impact. And that, of course, is a much more complicated question. Nonetheless, much visual memory work is rooted in this connection between seeing, feeling, knowing, or questioning, and then hopefully change. And this is the case for much of Patricio Guzman's work, especially his earlier films, and much other visual memory testimonial work. And it's also the approach that's typically taken by memory museums. There's good reason for this in the aftermath of atrocity, establishing a clear record of events and the identification of victims and perpetrators is often considered an essential component to moving forward. For those who have been and remain disappeared, specificity reminds us they are not faceless, anonymous numbers. They are remembered, beloved individuals, and their loved ones want them back. another sense, it makes sense that visual memory work relies on specificity. Yet, specificity is not the case or the approach taken by Kaitlin, and arguably not for Salcedo either. Or if it is, it's only in very limited fashion. Kaitlin's work is deliberately opaque, and Salcedo certainly directly references la violencia, as the conflict has been called in Colombia. But the loss and the grief of survivors is not so much specific as it is collective and affective. If a viewer does not come to Salcedo's work with background knowledge or experience or study of Colombia, her work does not actually give much of that knowledge or detailed memory work. It is, or at least I find it, very deeply affective and moving work, but in its intimacy, it also maintains a certain distance. We do not know the names of those who sat in those chairs or lay in those beds. And I want to be clear that my argument is not that her work suffers because it is insufficiently didactic. I don't think it does, but rather to question its relationship to memory. Is it art about memory, art that transmits memory, or is it art about the impact of violence? And those are not necessarily different, but nor are they necessarily the same. And if it is about memory, the question then becomes whose memory and for whom and why? And memory of what? Of a collective loss? But of course, we know that part of the problem in Colombia and elsewhere, including in the United States, is the vast divergence of understanding and opinion about conflict. So with memory art, a critical question is, who do we speak for and to? And do they have what they need in order to hear? And furthermore, and this is something that Saloni also mentioned, what makes something memory art? If we take seriously the potential for memory art to do certain things or produce certain effects, as well as taking seriously the question to and for whom the art speaks, the question of the limits and possibilities inherent in both opacity and specificity are deserving of much closer look. And this seems to be, to me, one of the most important and exciting paths laid from this project for others to follow. In case anyone in the room is looking for a dissertation topic, there is one. Okay, so then the next point I want to bring up as I was reading through this is the role of citation and iterability and memory art and memory museums. So I'm referencing here Jacques Derrida and his essay Signature Event Context, in which he emphasizes the importance of citationality and iterability in the event of speech. And I'm also fully outing myself as someone who has a PhD in performance studies, because this is a really important sort of foundational piece to performance. But in this essay, he emphasizes the importance of citation and iterability in the event of speech, questioning whether a performative statement can succeed if its formulation does not repeat a coded or iterable statement. So Derrida writes, every sign, linguistic or non-linguistic, spoken or written, in a small or large unit can be cited, put between quotation marks. In doing so, it can break with every given context, engendering an infinite of new contexts in a manner which is absolutely illimitable. This citationality, this duplication or duplicity, this iterability of the mark is neither an accident nor an anomaly. It is that abnormal without which a mark could not even have a function called normal. What would a mark be that could not be cited, or one whose origins would not get lost along the way? While not using the language of citation and iteration, Andreas points to the heavily signified repetition of the beds in both Kaitlin and Salcedo's work, and not just the beds, but the mattresses, the tables, and the chairs. I think that part of what makes them so effective and affective as signifiers of absence is that they are foundational pieces to our most intimate human spaces. They're where we gather to eat, to sleep, and to be together with our loved ones. A bed has no reason to exist but for a person to lie in. Thus, even when taken out of the bedroom or the kitchen and placed in a painting or nailed to a wall, these intimate pieces carry with them strong citational marks that we recognize visually and effectively, even when taken so out of context. Although in a very different way, and this is a bit of a tangent, I also find this to be largely true among memory museums. They all seem to emerge in conversation with each other, functioning within specific recognizable semiotic codes. An examination of citation and iteration would be a fascinating inclusion in the study of artworks and spaces from really, truly distinct contexts across the global South. More broadly, the relationship between memory art and citation and iterability, to my knowledge, is all but understudied, but it is certainly deserving of much closer analysis, especially if and as we move toward more transnational, comparative, global South memory scholarship. And the last point that I will make, and I'm sure I'm hitting my time here, is the question of residue and material remains and its affective connections. Remains and residue of the past are the organizing principle of Guzman's film Nostalgia for the Light, but they also show up across many of these works, in Salcedo's work, in Sudan's installation, elsewhere. And of course, these are the residues of human existence. So returning to my previous point about citation in the chapter on shadow play, Andreas notes that the shoes, glasses, and hair provide a direct reference to the Holocaust and some of the memory exhibitions at Auschwitz and elsewhere. These belongings, he points out, provide an emotional link to the dead. I would be very interested in closer exploration of residue and materiality in relation to memory and memory art, especially in cases when it is literally embedded in the table and the chair and so on. It's quite difficult for me to study Salcedo's work and not think immediately of mass graves, of Domingo Giribaldi's photographs in Peru when the mass graves were dug up and what was laid out on the bright blue tarps for family to identify were not bodies, but small shoes, worn buttons, and plastic hair clips. Of Guatemalan artist Regina Jose Galindo's many artistic pieces about residue and materiality in mass graves and loss. It also made me think of something Marita Sturken has written about after the World Trade Center was bombed. Families of the victims were eventually given little glass jars of dust because there were no bodies to return. Mass graves are above all crime scenes, even as they contain material remnants of loss that may provide some solace to survivors. It also may not. And this is a topic that I would love for us collectively as a community of memory scholars to think through in more sustained fashion. Deeply affective residue, material remains, and the way they bridge between artwork, crime scene evidence, mass grave, affective memory keeper, marker of loss, and detritus, and ephemerality. I think there's so much more here than any of us have uncovered yet. And it feels increasingly important for us to take up. And I will end there and just thank Andreas again for such a rich and thought-provoking text. It was a pleasure to read and one I will return to in my teaching and my own scholarship. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kaitlin. Again, thank you, Saloni. You've both put so many important issues on the table, raised so many key questions, I think, for the book and for Andreas and for all of us. So I'd love to give Andreas a chance to respond first. And please, in the meantime, think of your questions. Again, you can either use the chat function to pose questions, or after Andreas is done, raise your hand and we'll call on you. Thanks.
Well, Saloni and Kaitlin, thank you so much for your robust engagement with my book and for the excellent questions that you raise. I'm also grateful to you for having shared your questions with me beforehand so that I don't have to talk off the top of my head, but I've had a little chance to think about and to try to come up with some relatively short and concise answers, but it'll still take a number of minutes to get through since there's so many questions on the table, so bear with me. Let me begin with Saloni's question about the category of memory art. I mean, far from having any normative ideal in mind, I use the category as a historically contingent one. I'm, of course, aware of the fact that all art depends on memory. Memory of idealized pasts, memory of forms. Think of the pathos formen of Aby Warburg, for instance, the repurposing of storylines, of mythologies, of utopias, etc. But the historically specific phenomenon I try to grasp with the term memory art is the rise of artistic practices that deal with the violences of the 20th century. Fascism, communism, modernization, colonialism, and decolonization. Memory art emerged at a time when the earlier 20th century imaginaries of the future waned and were replaced by an increasing focus on various difficult pasts and their legacies in the present. Memory art problematizes the very notion of memory. It just doesn't simply give it or offer it to us, but it problematizes the notion of memory, of witnessing, of testimony, and its related problems. It probes the effects, the shortcomings, and future potential of memory politics. But then there's a second dimension here, because this very specific shift was part of a larger shift in the perceptions of time and space that took hold in the late 20th century and accelerated after the introduction of the World Wide Web. Now here, of course, I'm making a somewhat speculative argument, but it is embodied for me in Alexander Kluge's pithy statement that where he spoke of the attack of the present on the rest of time. What role for the past in a consumer society that is characterized by a flat present and the exploitative plundering of multiple cultural pasts? That would be the question. Now, the first time, let me turn to my work and where the term emerged there. The first time I used the term memory art was in a catalog essay for a group exhibit in Toronto in 1998. It was called Displacements, and the show included works by Rachel Whiteread, Miroslav Balka, and Doris Salcedo. In other words, 2 European and 1 American artist. And this gets me to your third question, Saloni. I'll come back to the others later on. My concept of memory art was never meant to be limited or to belong to the global South. My own lifelong interest in memory was, after all, grounded in very specific generational experiences of having grown up in Germany after the Third Reich and the Shoah. So why the focus on the global South in this book? 2 points. First, it resulted from a growing annoyance that art theory and art history journals like October, in studied ignorance, kept publishing only about art from the Northern Transatlantic. Now, finally, this may changing. After all, you, Saloni, have published this wonderful conversation with Gita Kapoor, and it was published in October. So things are slowly changing there. But more importantly for me, there was my sense that the kind of art politics conjunction, so central and generative in the 1920s and 30s, had witnessed a fascinating and transformative renewal among these memory artists from the global South, whether they directly refer to it or not, but in their practice, there was this renewal. And that said, I agree with you that it is time to expand this work toward art in Europe that deals with migration and colonialism, and toward artists in the US that deal with the histories of slavery and racism in the United States. Artists like you mentioned, like Carol Walker and others, Mark Bradford or Theaster Gates, whose show in the new museum I just recently saw and was extremely impressed by. So writing about the global South, for me, as a Europeanist, was not easy. And I could talk more about that. But realizing how these artists' work was mostly treated in the West, in its individual affiliations with European and US modernism and avant-gardism, Kentrism and Expressionism, Salcedo and Minimalism, I set out to develop a structure for my book that would put their works in touch with each other comparatively. That's your second question. And across a South-South axis. And whether this has been successful or not remains to be seen. But I've been encouraged, at least by some of the responses. Now, Kaitlin, I very much, picking up on the notion of the axis, I very much like your suggestion that rather than speaking of a South-South or South-North axis, it would be better to speak of webs, which allows for strong and weak relations and for temporal changes of ruptures and the forging of new links over time. The metaphor of the web, as long as we're not talking about the digital web, the metaphor of the web is just better since it points to the fragility of such relations. But let me address your major question about abstraction or opacity versus specificity in the visual field. No question documenting and seeing atrocity is essential to public opinion, memory politics, accountability, and human rights. You say that the question is not whether images can have an impact, but how and under what conditions they can have an impact. True enough. But isn't the reverse also true? And I think you point to that yourself. And you would agree that seeing and making visible does not preclude forgetting, evading, and repressing. Much, of course, has been written about the dulling effect of atrocity images people see and turn away, and about the reaction of voyeurism combined with a moment of cheap compassion followed by satisfied forgetting. I mean, we know these kind of structures. Now, an artist like Salcedo is fundamentally aware of this conundrum and tries to articulate it in her work. Her aesthetic strategy is that she refuses to represent specific cases of violence she has researched as a co-witness. And she says, and some people might think this is a very arrogant statement, but I think it's ultimately correct, and I quote, "The stories cannot be told for the artwork to be." Now, in that scene, yes, she abstracts from the suffering from the specific cases that she deals with. But her sculptures are not abstract at all. They are concrete and specific, literally. The block of concrete on the chair, an image for the traumatic burden of the survivors. The bandaged bed frames, whose affective dimension relies precisely on the iterative, citational dimension of the bed, as you point out. And in my book, so I don't talk about the discourse of iteration and citation and repetition and collection, which is another huge field, of course. There are a lot of instances of such citations and reiterations in the way I describe the book, describe the works. Now, not making visible the atrocity her work refers to is the secret of the effect that this abstraction enables in the spectator willing to engage the work both from a distance and in intimate close-up. Now, I take your point that maybe these works are more about the afterlife of traumatic experiences. The block of concrete sort of being a metaphor for what Kentridge described as the rock of apartheid. There are very similarities that I didn't even talk about the book, which came to me at a later point. And so that is true, and yet this afterlife is, of course, related to the memory of to the memories of the violent history itself. Now, when you ask whose memory does it represent and why, I would simply suggest or ask, doesn't Salcedo herself try to move toward a collective memory of the Civil War, which everybody in Colombia, after all, knows about, beyond social divisions and political conflicts in Colombia, especially with her large projects in urban space? Doesn't she try to create that, to work toward that kind of collective memory, even though it may be a utopian dream to ever achieve it? And who does it address? I mean, I think it addresses everybody. It has the effect of healing, the potential effect of healing for survivors, and there are good examples in the history of the reception of her work. It instills acknowledgement in the perpetrators, which a fact that was quite successful in the case of Fragmentos, the museum that was, the floor of the museum that was built from the melted down, A-47s of the guerrilla. And it leads to the recognition of collective loss in all implicated citizens of Colombia. And then, of course, there's a whole other dimension of her more international global work but let's leave that aside for now. But let me quickly address the question in another way. Your work in Mapping Memory, which is a book that I find fascinating, is concerned with memory activism in the broadest sense. Mine is focused on the role of the arts and aesthetics within memory activism. Rather than simply calling attention to histories of political violence, this new memory art aims at producing a sustainable and living memory in the present. It uses aesthetic means to struggle against historical amnesia and the flat presentism of contemporary consumer and media culture. It does have its limits, yes, absolutely, but so does any specific documentation. Much has been documented. Accountability has usually not followed, which of course which forces us to double down on the need for documentation rather than abandoning it. But the point would be that memory as intervention has to work on both levels, the social, legal, and political level, and the aesthetic level. And here I find a distinction useful that Gregory Cholette has recently advanced in a book entitled Art Activism and the Activism of Art, which is a little book that actually was published in the same series in which my book came out. Art Activism and the Activism of Art. What's the difference, you might ask? Now, art activism is present in actions such as the famous Siluetazo of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, or Chilean performance artist Maria Jose Contreras' mobilizing hundreds of bodies lying down in a straight line on a major Santiago boulevard on the 40th anniversary of the military coup. It was called Querer no ver, wanting not to see, comparable perhaps to the example of Daniel Hernandez Salazar's Esclarecimiento photo images with which your book, Mapping Memory, begins. Now, all these events were performances in urban space, artists involved in social protest. The activism of art, however, is present in the work my book focuses on, the activism of art rather than art activism. Works made for and presented in galleries and museums, and what Doris, in shorthand, Doris Salcedo calls acts of memory. The fact that some of these works, however, also appeared in public urban space, even though only temporarily, this fact shows that the borders between art activism and the activism of art are no longer stable. The old divisions between real art and agitprop no longer pertain, and yet they are not the same. Both are needed and can reinforce each other in the best of cases. Art activism and the activism of art can impact public opinion, support legal proceedings, and help create a politics of fighting impunity. So let me end on a hopeful note. Together, I think, they can create sustainable living memory and support long-term struggles for social identities and human rights, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that response, which is really a whole new substantive round to which I'm sure the respondents would like to respond in turn. This is already such a rich discussion, and it's such a privilege to have you with us, Andreas. I have to say, it's just wonderful to hear you speak.
Well, it was great to get these questions and to be asked to respond to them.
To prepare in advance as well. And we do have some time. We usually go for about 90 minutes. So we've got, about 25 minutes to go. So we have time for questions from the audience if anyone has one. Otherwise, I'll maybe start with one myself. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading was sort of the time frame of the memory that your works are addressing. Which is you periodize pretty carefully as sort of post 40s, right? And you make that point in a couple of places. There's partition, etc. The kinds of state violence that you're looking at are ones of recent decades. So I wondered about the deeper time of political violence, and especially given Saloni's question about once we bring in some of these other artists, say from the north, but still working from sort of the south within the north, as Kaitlin.
Yeah, but in the slavery case, for instance.
Exactly, the slavery case, the colonialism case. Do you see, is there something different going on with those sorts of cases? Do you see traces of that deeper time in the artists you're looking? I mean, Kentridge would be an obvious example, right? Mine. Where you get not only a reflection on apartheid and the transition and the violence of that moment, but also that invocation of the slave ship, right? And so a sense that there's also a deeper layering of deeper time. I'm just curious if that's something you see elsewhere in these works, or if that raises different kinds of questions. I'm not sure.
Well, no, I would not want to limit the time frame to the post-1940s period. I mean, the other example in Kentridge that comes to my mind would be The Load and the Shoulders. I mean, this play performance in which he actually talks about, in which he sort of tries to represent and re-articulate the role of African soldiers within World War I. You know, that goes back to World War I. In the case of slavery and racism in this country, of course, we're going back to 1619. So the whole history of colonialism, you know, is going to be at stake. And in the German case, again, the early colonialism of Germany and Namibia is another kind of instance where it goes beyond to a deeper kind of time. But I have and that maybe I should have articulated that in some ways in the book, but it was not central, because I think for me, the key kind of element were the concerns of recent violences that have happened recently, you know, and to that extent, this period of the 1980s, 90s, etc., with 1989 as a major transformation, and here the whole memory issue in the post-Soviet Union would have to be discussed, which is completely outside my expertise. But you know, and it's a transition period in many ways, a transition to our own time, and so I focused on that and did not think so much about that earlier time. But I wouldn't exclude the possibility of doing that in discussions that continue, particularly in Germany. It's essential, as you. Michael, gebranntes Kind, right, as they say, would know very well. The relationship, Holocaust memory, colonialism memory, etc.
Oh, great, yeah, thank you for that. So the floor is open. Anyone from the audience who would like to join us with a question, or one of the respondents who would like to respond to Andreas's response, just give a signal. Happy to have that as well.
I actually did have one, not by way of response. I mean, I wish that we had many more hours to talk, because I would love to just keep digging into that. But one thing I was really curious about when I read is you mentioned that there were other artists who you would have liked to include, but you were not able to because of the pandemic limitations around travel. What are some of the other artists that you considered for inclusion in the book?
Oh God, now my age comes in the lack of memory. I don't remember. There's a Peruvian artist. There's a Peruvian artist who has done fantastic work. I haven't even seen it, and I would have needed to travel to Peru to see. Now, I don't remember his name. He's exhibited in Toronto, I know. And it's work about a prison island off the coast of Peru, completely stony kind of environment, where there was a prison riot in the 1980s, which was brutally repressed by the military, okay? And that was one example of an artist whom I would have liked to really include. I mean, but I'll have to dig up in my memory is just weak, and memory is weak. You know, I always used to joke, why did I get into memory studies? Because I started to forget more and more. But I'm sorry about that. But that would have been one example of a major figure who I couldn't include because of the pandemic.
I found it fascinating that in some ways in our discussion, Salcedo is one of the artists who we've returned to the most out of the group that you described, and I'm wondering why that might be, or if that is in any way significant. I mean, there does seem to be something about the degree to which she abstracts from, right, this issue that we've been talking about, abstracts from these specific cases. I mean, the method that you described, which I wasn't really aware of the kind of deep research that goes into the making of her works, but then disappears in the works themselves.
Disappears, yeah. Right.
I mean, there's something very challenging about it. I mean, I think it's incredibly powerful, but I also can see the kinds of issues that Kaitlin is raising are also issues that I was thinking about, not in a critical vein toward the work, but just these are the issues that one thinks about. The differences between, and I'll have to look for this book that you mentioned, art activism and the activism of art. This is clearly one of the major questions that I think your book raises. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious about the fact that Salcedo has been so central.
Yeah, and it also pertains to another question that Kaitlin raised. I mean, you know, these artists are extremely successful, right? And they have studios, they have very large, I mean, certainly Salcedo does, I know that, and Kentridge, they have studios with lots of employees. So there's a whole question of the economic structure that sustains this kind of work. You know, Salcedo's, for instance, Salcedo's work about migration into Europe, which was called Palimpsesto, an absolutely wonderful kind of installation, had a computer substructure, digital computer substructure that was so complex that it took years to even create it, and obviously cost a lot of money. So there's a question of that kind of work, which has been successful and has been you know, supported by museums and by galleries, etc., versus the local work, the grassroots work. But in some ways, these artists also emerged out of grassroots and then became successful, right? So I would not, one could immediately, of course, mount a big critique of the current structures of the Western art markets and the way it incorporates and digests, as it were, the work of these artists from the global South. But I'm not sure where that would leave us. I mean, because I do think that the achievement of this art of making possible our understanding of cases of historical violence in other parts of the world in a more detailed and deeper fashion is a very important effect of these works, even though it may limit only a few people.
Okay, we've got a question from Uku Sungun. Uku, do you want to speak up? Join us? Hello? There you are.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the talks. Thank you very much. I'm talking as an artist and activist from Germany, and exactly Mr. Huyssen, what you said is very, very, very true about the neoliberal capacity of, you know, taking over the agenda of some artworks in the art institutions. But still, I think as an artist, there are a lot of possibilities to set the conditions. So I don't think it's lost everything. But I want to ask another question. Ms. Murphy has mentioned, and this about it's very difficult to ask, but as an activist, art activist, I can see that memorial art is trying to close some discussions, artistic, discussions, conflicted discussions about the history, the past, the recent past in Germany, especially.
It wants to close them, you're saying?
Yes.
Shut them down?
Yes, for instance, right now we had a big meeting in Berlin on the 11th about the recent terrorist attack victims' families. And there was a huge protest of the families because the state has invited some and some excluded. And they were kind of attacking this I don't know, say this gesture of exactly. So whom to include? So there's a difficulty in these state memorials or state memory, and the activistic memory, which tries to change the narratives in a way. And there is the kind of huge imbalance, of course, and in that point, I just wanted to point out that sometimes it's really difficult to keep the struggles about memory alive instead of closing them down by a memorial or something like this. So that was just
well, that's why I focus on the kinds of artworks that I'm focusing on here, because I think their purpose is to keep questions open, not to close them down. But what you raise really is the other question which was, thrown at me in one of the events here at Columbia, legitimately so. I talk in the book about appropriation in reverse, counter-appropriation, right? And the question was, isn't the notion of appropriation a real problem? And my answer would have been, I describe, in other words, the appropriation that these artists practice of Western models of art, whether it's minimalism, Soviet art, expressionism or whatever, is indeed a kind of appropriation in reverse, but it makes possible certain kinds of work that they do. They find it productive. And appropriation, the appropriation you're talking about, is the appropriation top down by the state, by the government, sometimes also by institutions, including museums. Museums do appropriate. There's no question about that. But that is a kind of dialectic within the notion of appropriation itself that is absolutely try to argue against the making the notion of cultural appropriation completely, what's the word? To deny it, to ban it completely, ban cultural appropriation is a problem, because appropriation in its various forms is absolutely necessary to enable any kind of communication between different groups and across national borders. So it's unavoidable, and the project becomes especially salient in problems of translation. I did my dissertation in German literary studies on the romantic theory of appropriation, translation as appropriation. And there was a whole problem, that the can of worms that it opened up. And you're referring to it. I'm thankful that you bring it up in the discussion, because it's an important factor.
Okay, thank you, Uku. And we have a question also from Esti Esquera. Esti.
Hi, thank you for organizing this fantastic event, Michael. I really much enjoy listening to Andreas and the other two speakers. And I saw so many commonalities with my current project, which is on the afterlife of Guernica. And one of the things, I wasn't going to get into the subject of appropriation, but I find it a little bit problematic because I don't think these borrowings happen at the same level. So there are very particular power structures that condition what can be taken from whom and how it's acknowledged. And I'm always a little bit suspicious of establishing European cultural forms as the origins. In my work with Guernica, I've come across so many different remediations. I prefer this concept of remediation when it comes to artworks. That were described as appropriations or remakings of Guernica, establishing Guernica as the source, the origin, like the proper art form. And there was an African intervention that was very important for my project, because it unveiled the routes that the European forms took, right? That they were appropriations, if you want to call them that way, of African autochthonous forms, but then they were presented as European mastery of aesthetic forms, right? So I think that it has to be explained, contextualized, where these borrowings come from, what kind of conditions make them possible. Absolutely. Yeah. So, but my question is about this concept of abstract, specific renderings of traumatic events. And so one of the things that I found very interesting in exploring the routes and afterlives of Guernica is what art historian Jutta Hell says about the ontological status of the artwork, that according to her, it's never given, it's never fixed, right? And that's why it has to be fought over and over again, because it can be appropriated by different powers, right? For very different and sometimes contradictory purposes. So, like in the case of Guernica, it can be an invocation of peace and the end of war, but it has also been used to propose war for humanitarian purposes, right? So this kind of...
Where has it done that? Where has it been used in order to propose war, you said?
Yeah, so in the case of the invasion of Iraq, it was appealed as in order to prevent catastrophes like the one depicted by Picasso in Guernica, we have to militarily intervene. And recently in the context of Ukraine, right, the president of Ukraine said, this is a new Guernica, as Picasso represented it, we have to, and Guernica itself is a painting that was made to benefit the Republican forces in the war, right? It was against it was to support a particular side in that war, right? I mean, I totally agree with Jutta Held that the ontological status of an artwork is not a given, but I'm also interested in how certain artworks, through, I wouldn't say abstraction, but ambiguity, in a way open the door to multiple interpretations, right? Because that meaning is not settled. And for different reasons, in some cases, perhaps to accommodate a broad understanding of what event was, right? In like collective memory, it's such a broad concept that if we dig into it, we may find that what people may think is collective memory, it's very different from what other people think, right? What's the collective understanding of the past? So I was thinking about like your take on this idea of like ambiguity and how sometimes there is no such a clear differentiation between the art of activism and art activism. And I go back to this example of Guernica, that it started as a campaign to bring support to the Republican cause financially and militarily. And then as it came, it transitioned from propaganda art to a masterpiece, right? It was understood in a very different light. So from being the art of activism, it became art activism, right? In a different
activism, yeah.
way.
Right.
So
that's a very good point. There are lots of lines of flight that one could pursue right now. I mean, interesting, of course, in terms of appropriation, what it refers to. Picasso refers us back to the appropriation of African art, you know, either as a ethnographic object or as art object. You know, there were two kinds of appropriations. I mean, the art critic Carl Einstein, who wrote in the 1920s and 30s, has sort of addressed that and represents this conundrum. He criticized the appropriation of African art objects by ethnographic museums, reducing them to their ethnographic essence. But but at the same time, he himself advocated decontextualizing them and to treat them as artistic form only. So there was another kind of form of appropriation, which was perhaps equally problematic as the first one. You know, and this whole issue, of course, is embedded in these problematic, here we get into the issue of colonialism, the concept of primitivism, which dominated the field for such a long time and which has to be, unraveled and criticized. As to collective memory, what is collective memory? I mean, I've become increasingly skeptical that there is such a thing as collective memory. There are group memories. They're always, we're never going to get to it may not even be desirable to have a wholesale collective national memory. And it's, of course, always, collective memory is mostly discussed in the context of the national frame. I mean, there was an early stage, of course, of memory studies. We all know about this with Pierre Nora, which talked about collective memory only in the national context. And that context has been blown apart, even though some people are trying to reconstruct it right now. But thank you for your comment. Sounds like a fascinating project. Good luck with it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, maybe a short question, and Sharon Zelnick has her hand up. So Sharon, I will give you the floor here. Can't hear you though, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. Still not.
There's-
Okay, now you can hear me. You should be able to all hear me. Thank you for all of these really rich comments and the discussion. It was really fascinating. One thing though that wasn't brought up yet, that struck me while I was reading your introduction is at the end you mentioned the question of redemption and how it has this fragile and fleeting quality to its nature. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to what aspects of redemption become available through and in memory art, and what aesthetic and thematic qualities make some memory art more redemptive than others.
Well, there was good reason that I mentioned the word only at the very end and not at the beginning, because basically it shows that I don't want to talk about it. But no, I mean, seriously, the discourse of redemption is part of the, part of the discussions, but I would like to be, very pragmatic about it. Where can there be redemption? Where can there be some redress or some feeling of reconciliation? And I think one good example, and it can happen as a result of some of the works that I've studied here. The example I would give, and here, Michael, you're absolutely right. Salcedo is central for all of this and has been, for me, she's the sort of lodestar of this whole project. But her work called Fragmentos, this museum space where the floor was basically created from the melted down steel of the AK-47s of the guerrillas. The way this was produced, I can't go into all the detail right now. The process in which it was produced, to a large degree, with the help of a group of women survivors, women who had survived rape during the Civil War, and who she brought together in order to hammer that floor. I mean, to hammer the models for the floor that were then, into which the steel was poured is eventually to make up the tiles of the floor. There's a very moving kind of a documentary about it, where these women speak about what this work on this project meant for them. The hammering, in other words, it was as if they hammered out their memories of the atrocities that they had suffered, and they created a kind of collectivity around it. But it is a group collective memory that was created there, not some kind of national redemption or global redemption or anything of that sort. But, I think the reason I shy away from the term is that I would want to leave theological concepts to where they belong.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that that particular Salcedo work is a really great place also to end, and with those thoughts about the limited, fragile but necessary possibilities of some sort of redemption, some sort of positive work of memory and art. Seems like a good place for us to end today. I'm really grateful to Saloni, Mathur, and Kaitlin Murphy again for fabulous responses, and I am, of course, especially grateful for Andreas Huyssen for his work over many years, for this book in particular, and then for his generosity in being with us today, and all the insights that he has shared with us. I think it's been a really terrific event. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure. Great to see you both. Bye-bye.
Yes.
And stop the recording. And